right. You know, it's funny, we use this thing. John Lovett tried to make me make the logo for Pod Save the World a spinning cheeseburger. And he made our design team fabricate one out of some material, and now we just put it up with no context. So, anyway, hey J Street, how you doing? First of all, I just want to say thank you to Jeremy, Jess, Ami, the whole J Street team. What you guys have built in a short period of time is truly amazing, and you should be incredibly proud of that work. And thank you to all the people that decided to spend a weekend talking about foreign policy and diplomacy. It really matters that you care and are disengaged. So, you know, credit to you guys for showing up. This is our second ever live Pod Save the World taping, and I just first want to introduce and thank our guest host, who needs no introduction. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner, an incredible columnist for the New York Times, the co-host of The Argument, a fantastic podcast that you should all check out, Michelle Goldberg. And as always, former Deputy National Security Advisor to Barack Obama and chief protagonist in all right-wing fever dreams involving foreign policy, Ben Rhodes. I'm just putting this on my lap. You're going to see how the sausage is made when we do the show. Later in the show, we'll be joined by two amazing activists, Maisam Jaijuli and Mikhail Manikin. You're going to love them. We've been hanging out backstage for the last half an hour. But before we get to a conversation about the U.S.-Israeli relationship and a progressive foreign policy platform, we have to talk about a little breaking news because the news won't stop breaking us. Let's start with impeachment. So Watergate... Watergate had deep throat. 2019 star impeachment witness may end up being Rudy Giuliani's butt. Here's a quick recap of the week. So this week alone, we heard from the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who confirmed in 15 single-spaced pages of excruciating detail how President Trump blocked security aid to Ukraine in an effort to get dirt on Joe Biden and to find Hillary Clinton's server, which he seems to think is hiding out in Ukraine like Whitey Bulger or Osama bin Laden. It's good that the White House cybersecurity czar doesn't know what the cloud is. It's compelling. Lacking any substantive response to this testimony, Sentient Axe body spray canister and Congressman Matt Gaetz led a group of congressmen directly from the fraternity mixer to the House Intelligence Committee's secure room to try to shut down the impeachment process. We here in Washington are waiting to see whether the former National Security Advisor John Bolton will be testifying, and Rudy Giuliani is deciding who to butt dial next. So, we laugh at these clowns to stay sane, but Michelle, you recently traveled to Ukraine to hear directly from activists about the ways in which Rudy and Donald Trump's actions are harming their anti-corruption work. Can you tell us a bit about that trip?
Right, so we can all say Rudy Giuliani and everyone laughs and everyone knows that he's a clown. But if you're in Ukraine, you don't necessarily know that the president's personal lawyer is not someone to be taken seriously. And you can't even really afford to not take him seriously because, you know, Ukrainians have so much riding on American support. So I did a couple of pieces in Ukraine, but the one, I guess, that meant the most to me was, you know, when Giuliani went over there and started claiming that part of the conspiracy theory, and you can't really keep it all straight because it's not meant to be totally coherent, is that Paul Manafort was framed, right? Which, you know, Paul Manafort's in prison for the money that he took out of Ukraine. But the idea is that you remember when they found the black ledger during Donald Trump's presidential campaign, when anti-corruption activists in Ukraine found this ledger from Yanukovych's regime that just listed all these payments to various people, and I think it listed $13 million to Manafort. Yeah. Manafort had to leave the Trump campaign as a result. So part of Giuliani's conspiracy theory, and not just Giuliani, I mean, it's also a Russian conspiracy theory, a lot of people are pushing this, is that this ledger was fake, and that it was faked by kind of puppets of George Soros. And so Giuliani has been in Ukraine very specifically smearing anti-corruption activists and journalists. You know, one of the most famous investigative journalists in the country was actually advising the new president until Giuliani, because one of the strangest things about Ukraine, and I've never seen this anywhere else, is how many journalists go into government, right? And a lot of them stay journalists while they're in government, which I think is fascinating.
Wow.
Like, you can be an investigative journalist and in parliament at the same time.
Wow, okay.
So that's true of this guy I'm talking about, Sergei Lyshenko. So he was advising the new president until all of a sudden Giuliani comes there and says that he's, anti-American, that he's tried to take down Trump by faking this black ledger. All of a sudden he becomes a sort of toxic figure in Ukrainian politics. And the reason that he specifically was singled out is because, a lot of the Ukrainians who are whispering to Giuliani are these corrupt figures with their own agenda. So you could imagine why a super corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine would have a grudge against one of the most famous anti-corruption activists in the country, right?
Yeah.
So the two names that are hard to keep straight are Yuri Lutsenko, who's bad, and Sergei Lyshenko, who's good. And so, but you have basically Yuri Lutsenko telling, and the other guy, Shulkin, but both of them telling Giuliani that, like, they're picking out their personal enemies in Ukrainian society and saying these are the guys who tried to frame Paul Manafort and tried to torpedo Trump's election. And it's totally disconcerting for them. Sergei Lyshenko said to me, I would expect, I'm used to the mob coming after me. I'm used to, like, corrupt oligarchs coming after me. I'm not used to kind of United States officials coming after me.
Yeah, no, I bet. Meanwhile, they've been at war with Russian separatists for several years. 13,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives in the fighting. It's an ongoing hot war. Your colleague at the New York Times detailed really compellingly the stakes for these individuals. But then I noticed you raised your hand as a Soros plant.
Right. Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to get off your chest?
I'm sorry I did that because that'll turn up somewhere, I'm sure. No, I mean, look, I think part of what we have to recognize when we look at this, because you're right, it's easy to laugh at, like, the Brooks Brothers riot at the House Intelligence Committee and the kind of insane conspiracy theorizing emanating from the Donald Trump Twitter feed. But as you point out, like, this is a real country that is in the center of a major geopolitical controversy. They've been invaded by a larger neighbor that has annexed already a portion of their territory, has been literally fueling a war that has killed 13,000 people. And when Donald Trump looks at that country, the only thing he sees is his own political interest.
Right.
And he's willing to corrupt every lever of U.S. foreign policy. So someone who worked in the White House, what do you have in terms of the tools of U.S. foreign policy? You have assistance. And they basically turned critical military assistance that the Ukrainian government depends upon into a tool to get them to investigate their opponents. You have the possibility of a meeting with the President of the United States or other high-ranking U.S. officials. And they held out those meetings as leverage to get them to prosecute or pursue their political opponents. And so literally, they've turned the entire foreign policy of the United States of America into a vehicle to validate really just crazy conspiracy theories, right? And I don't think we fully can appreciate the consequences of that because we're in our political drama here, but the rest of the world is just looking at that and saying, well, this is all these people now care about.
Yeah. One place where the stakes of the Trump foreign policy decision-making has been quite clear has been in northeastern Syria. So it's been a tragic and profoundly confusing, I would say, couple of weeks. So on October 13th, President Trump decided to withdraw our troops from northern Syria. And he did so in such a rush fashion that we were bombing our own equipment with F-15s on the way out so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of ISIS or others. Now we are apparently sending troops back into northern Syria to protect the oil fields in the region, if only there had been some way to know in advance that there was oil or oil fields in that area. That's the problem with fossil fuels, is they pop up like that, There's no time to plan. So Bashar al-Assad got a whole bunch of territory back. Russia further cements its grip in the region. Prime Minister Erdogan is openly talking about ethnic cleansing, so it's pretty dire stuff. Michelle, you interviewed these folks in Ukraine. You hear this from our European allies. Our friends in Israel are understandably confused as well by these wild foreign policy swings. Your colleague at the Times, David Halfinger, wrote a piece where he quoted a bunch of folks in Israel, including former Netanyahu aides, who were worried that if Trump could abandon the Kurds, Israel could be next. How damaging do you think that kind of sentiment is to America's standing, our ability to get things done, or work with others?
Well, I mean, it's obviously you would be crazy to kind of stake your fortunes on the support of the Americans, right? That would be madness. I would be a little bit surprised. It's hard for me to think of a scenario in which Trump abandons Israel, just because he doesn't see the Kurds as kind of doing that much for him.
Right.
Right? Whereas he sees his relationship with Israel, I think, as being pretty productive for him. Certainly the current government of Israel is extremely obsequious to him. So, I mean, I can't imagine any country can't predict what Donald Trump's going to do and kind of can't draw up their own strategic plans with any sort of certainty about leadership from the United States. But I think there's a few countries that probably can count on Donald Trump's continuing support. Israel, Russia, Saudi Arabia.
Right, yeah. Well, if I were to summarize, well put, well said. I mean, if you're to summarize the Trump worldview, right, it's like, if Obama did it, it's bad. If you're an authoritarian, you're cool. If you lead a democracy or a powerful woman like Angela Merkel, I'm going to be a jerk to you. And then you're right, they carve off little bits that are politically beneficial, mostly in Florida.
Well, you said something interesting, right? So the one thing that I think Israel probably could do that would maybe undermine this relationship, and I hate to say it, is to elect a woman.
Yeah.
What? I think when you look at this, though, it's part of a pattern that is problematic. That's a gentle word. But, because you take the fact that we've pulled out of all these international agreements, right, which already erodes the capacity of other nations to trust us, because it's not just that you pulled out of the Obama agreements, Paris, the Iran deal, but, arms control treaties and other things. Mm-hmm. But then the Kurds, the reason the Kurdish issue is so important, the whole reason that we initiated this model in the Obama administration is that the American people were no longer going to support large ground operations, large numbers of U.S. troops fighting terrorists. After the Iraq War, that was just not an option. And we had a terrorist organization, ISIS, that we had to deal with. And so what did we do? We put together this totally kind of new model where you had an American-led air campaign, then you had American intelligence, then a small number of American special forces, but we went and enlisted a ground force for this effort. And the Kurds lost 11,000 people fighting essentially as our ground force. Putting aside the complete moral betrayal, what's going to happen the next time America needs people to help us fight terrorism? And part of the issue, and this is why groups like this are so important, the credibility hole that we have to get out of. It's not just the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States. It's the fact that we elected Donald Trump the president of the United States, right? And so, and that means that, maybe they'll do it again, right? And so it'll take a long time, I think, to restore the capacity of other nations to trust us, or groups like the Kurds who we want to be our allies in a fight like this to trust us. Yeah. That, to me, is the bigger issue.
Yeah. So consensus winners of this decision Trump made in Syria seem to be Assad, the Russians, Turkey, and Iran. I know it's early, but those are not Israel's best friends, right, shall we say. Yeah. Do you have a sense of what this new normal might mean for Israel's security?
Well, yeah, it's not good. And the problem, because if you looked at the way in which the Syrian civil war was kind of coming to some form of an end, is, Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers had kind of consolidated this level of control over the coastal areas, where most of the population is. But the United States really was, the key player in northern and eastern Syria in terms of an external player, with the Kurdish allies and with some Syrian Arabs who cooperated with us. And so therefore we were at the table, right? And so in discussions about how is power going to be shared in the future, how are we going to deal with the humanitarian situation, how are we going to deal with the repatriation of refugees, the United States was going to have a voice in those negotiations. And now we've completely vacated that role. We're not at that table.
Right.
That table is now Vladimir Putin and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and Tayyip Erdogan, right? And that's not what Israel would want. Where are we? We're at some small oil field that Donald Trump figured out existed in eastern Syria, mainly because there was like clearly some meeting at the Pentagon where they're like, well, how can we convince Trump to keep some troops in Syria?
Yeah.
Let's point out the fact to him that there's an oil field there, and he loves to say, let's get the oil.
Yeah, Michelle, there was a background quote in the Washington Post story about this where basically the Pentagon was bragging that they tricked him. Do you get a lot of calls from sources bragging that they tricked the President of the United States? Is that common?
My sources are not the people who are in a position to trick the president. But I mean, I feel like that's kind of the obvious modus operandi right now. I mean, Jim Mattis gave this interview, was it today or yesterday, where he talked about how he told Donald Trump, you know, when you replace me, you need to get someone who's not a yes man, otherwise you're going to get impeached, right? And so the correlate, I mean, the implication is that either you get someone who will stop you from doing what you want to do, or you're going to commit crimes, right? Or you're, so,
yes.
So that's kind of the entire government. Well, you had a layer of people whose entire function in government was kind of managing Donald Trump, you know, diverting him, subverting his will. And as those people have been hollowed out, you see sort of more and more rolling disasters.
Yeah.
But, you know, I can't resist. If you listen to the podcast, you know I have a particular set of views about these people who held themselves out as these grown-ups, right?
You're a big fan.
I mean, so we've talked about, you know, Jim Mattis, who can't criticize the sitting president as he's on his leadership book tour. John Kelly could be a yes
sorry,
man.
that's what I meant before, John Kelly, not Jim Mattis.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
no, now I'm going to... John Kelly was a yes man for the family separation policy at the border.
Mm-hmm.
John Kelly was a yes man on a lot of things, right? Just because, you know, he didn't happen to be sitting down the hall while Rudy Giuliani was cooking up this particular scheme doesn't mean that a lot of stuff wasn't happening there when he was the chief of staff.
Yeah, no. Michelle, you can be forgiven for forgetting which former cabinet official said that they were asked to commit crimes because Rex Tillerson literally joked about the same thing with Bob Schieffer years ago, and everyone said, oh, ha, ha, official Washington, crimes are funny.
Why
and now
is
he's
that so
being
funny?
impeached. I know. It's not all that funny. We're skipping through a little bit because we have a lot to cover, but so let's talk about the Israeli government formation for a minute. So our friends in Israel have gone through 2 elections this year with no resolution. I cannot imagine how frustrating that is. Both essentially have ended in a tie between Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and former Israeli Army Chief Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. Netanyahu was unable to form a governing coalition, so now Benny Gantz has about a month to try. Question for both of you, but I'd love to start with you, Michelle. I'm not going to ask anyone to predict what's going to happen in Israel because, boy, was I bad at doing that when it came to American politics in 2016. But if we think Gantz forms a government, what might change? I mean, how should we think about a post-Netanyahu political world?
Well, so what some of my Israeli friends have said, you know, including just back there just now, right, is that, you know, Benny Gantz is not that great from the perspective of your average member of J Street, right? He's certainly better than Netanyahu, but he also says he wants to, you know, annex the Jordan Valley, right? He also, you know, as a matter of fact, he kind of blames Netanyahu for stealing the idea from him.
Right.
And so in terms of, you know, foreign policy, in terms of a 2-state solution, it's not clear that he would be that much better, but I guess, well, he would probably, and this is not a high bar, be less overtly corrupt.
Right.
Right? And, you know, and then the thing that's happening within Israel is not unlike the thing that's happening in the United States. It's happening in so many of these democracies that have, you know, fallen to authoritarian leaders, which is that their leaders are kind of waging war on civil society. So if you can roll that back, then you can hopefully have, you know, kind of room for a genuinely, anti-occupation politics to grow.
Yeah.
I think that's the key point here, which is that, you know, over the, you know, and I saw this, I mean, one of the great what-ifs of history, right, is that there was this election in 2009 where Zippy Livni got more votes, but couldn't form a coalition, and then Netanyahu becomes the prime minister. And obviously, the beginning of a very warm relationship with Barack Obama over the next 8 years. But what I saw too, though, is that the politics in Israel were getting more and more kind of poisonous, and you saw this influence of Netanyahu being exerted over the media, and you saw every election season, the rhetoric emanating from Netanyahu becoming more and more extreme. If ever there was a fork in the road and a choice to make, it moved to the right, and so the equilibrium of Israeli politics moved further and further to the right. But it also kind of just became something that revolved around his personality. We're dealing with something very similar in the United States now, obviously with Trump. And I don't think you can discount the value. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever done like a cleanse, but both Israel and the United States need a cleanse.
Okay.
And Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu have sent a lot of toxins into the body politic of their respective countries. And so while it doesn't mean every problem is going to be solved if Benny Gantz is the next prime minister, I do think just the capacity to start over again in terms of the political debate inside of Israel and the capacity to get beyond the psychodrama. With Netanyahu, it's always there are enemies here. And look, it's not like Israeli politics is this kind of gentle place. It's always been rollicking, right? But I don't think we can overestimate the importance of, if you want to deal with the problems that people in this room care about, we have to move on here, right? And so just the step of saying we're going to get beyond Netanyahu, I think would be very, very important and constructive. In the same way that getting rid of Trump isn't going to solve all of our problems, but it's certainly a necessary step.
Yeah. Well put. It's a good time to thank our sponsor, Goop, for the show tonight.
Yeah.
It's not really a sponsor. Okay, so our cleanse is coming up. The 20 election is coming up. I think it's safe to assume it's going to be, as bad as you think it's going to be worse. And Israel will be one of the many political footballs kicked around. Trump so far has tried to argue that being a Democrat is somehow antithetical to the concept of Judaism, which is an interesting, very cool, very not dangerous thing to argue. You guys may have heard of a push poll before. So a push poll is when you pretend to call voters as if you're doing an opinion survey, but your actual goal is to say awful things about an opponent or an issue in an effort to influence that individual's opinion. It's very effective and very unethical. We actually, the crack team at Crooked Media, got our hands on a Republican push poll about Democrats in Israel. So we're going to give it a listen.
Hey, this is John.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm contacting you about some important developments in the relationship between America and our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel. Do you care about Israel and America's relationship to that country?
Yes.
Great. Do you have a moment to answer a few questions?
I thought you were Postmates.
Did you know that, according to the President of the United States, any Jewish person that votes for a Democrat shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty?
I mean, I know he tweeted that, but I don't...
Do you agree or disagree?
I disagree.
According to a well-respected U.S. Senator, House Democrats hate Israel and hate our own country.
Wait, what senator?
It's not important.
It was Lindsey Graham.
It might have been.
Respected.
Do you support House Democrats despite their showing such hostility to Israel, a democracy and our greatest ally in the region? Or do you support the Democratic view that Israel can, and I quote, eat it?
You can't just say something's a quote. Who said Israel should eat it?
Do you believe that Democrats and Iran, who together have formed the anti-Israel supergroup Barack Ahmadinejad, should be stopped from selling off the Golan Heights to the highest bidder?
Okay. I'm pretty sure that's not happening. I think this is a push poll.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, it is.
Fine. Fine, it is. It's a push poll. All day I call senior citizens in places like Scottsdale and Boynton Beach and terrify them. Yesterday, a woman cried.
And you wanted more from your life. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
And it's not only possible but necessary to support Israel while criticizing its failures, because to believe in a Jewish state is to believe in a state that lives up to the moral and humanitarian values at the core of Judaism itself, even if that might not fit on a bumper sticker and may lead to unfair and partisan attacks if you make the mistake of telling the truth with all the nuance and empathy that requires.
I should have gone to law school.
So obviously that was fake news, but I'd like to thank Nar Melkonian and John Lovett from our team for lending us their acting chops. But that could be real. Michelle, can you help us prepare ourselves for the attacks that may be made under the guise of supporting Israel? Like, how worried are you about how nasty this campaign is going to get?
Well, there's no bottom to how nasty it's going to get. I mean, to me, one of the things that makes me sometimes think that, contrary to Jewish theology, there is a hell and we are in it, is that not only are the fascists back, but the fascists are back and they're accusing the Jews of anti-Semitism, right? I mean,
Right.
like, so you see this Sebastian Gorka. Sebastian Gorka's, a lifetime member of this Hungarian Nazi-aligned group.
Yeah.
Is going around calling all these Jewish Democrats anti-Semites because of their opposition to Israel. And it works a little bit. Like, he singled out this one Elizabeth Warren staffer. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was saying that, his mom, who I think is, kind of relatively well-informed, but not super news obsessive, that she heard something that there's an anti-Semite on Elizabeth Warren's campaign, right? An anti-Semite named Max Berger. And so, but that's this, but that's I think where we are. You have this. It happens over and over again. It's so bizarre. There was this one group, this one evangelical group that accused the ADL of anti-Semitism because the ADL
makes sense.
had criticized something that Trump's, one of Trump's kind of white nationalist excursions, and so. I think, so that's what we're going to be up against, and I really, really hope, and it's, what makes that kind of rhetoric possible has been the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, right? Because only if those two things are the same can a Gentile accuse a Jew of anti-Semitism because the Jew is to the left of them on Israel. And so I think you have to kind of disentangle that in order to inoculate against these kind of attacks.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Facebook, for enabling this. Ben, Trump literally said, if you vote for Democrat, you're being disloyal to the Jewish people and disloyal to Israel, because apparently he kind of understands the dual loyalty trope, but not well enough to avoid it. Obviously, he's shameless. He's going to lie. He's going to say whatever. But, to Michelle's point, I mean, how do you think progressives should or can criticize Israeli government policies without making people in Israel feel singled out unfairly?
Well, first of all, Trump gave us kind of a, after all of the I think at times, obviously, either willfully disinformed debates about various comments made by Democratic members of the House, it was very useful of Donald Trump to literally show us exactly what the problem is with accusations of dual loyalty. I mean, that's exactly what they were criticizing members of the House, Ilhan Omar in particular, for. But I think there's a couple ways to answer this. I mean, one is, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, frankly, which is that a lot of the things I would be concerned about in Israel, like, I'm even more concerned about them in the United States. This is not a matter of singling out Israel. It's a matter of having a set of principles. But I also think the really important thing to try to do is to frame what your positive vision is. Instead of it just being about, thus far we've been pretty negative, but I believe that progressives have a vision for this country, the United States, that is a much more inclusive and prosperous country and much more secure country. And I also think that what we want for Israel is not something that is punitive. It's not about just heaping criticism on Israel. It's about the fact that we believe that a progressive vision of the U.S.-Israel relationship and a progressive vision of the future of Israel is going to be better for Israel, right? So this is not about wanting to make them the foil for Democrats. It's about the fact that we believe that a two-state solution is in Israel's interest. We believe that an Israel that can count on a progressive partner in the United States to make a case for an Israel that we want to stand behind, because it's not engage in certain policies that are very difficult to defend. That is in the interest of the United States-Israel relationship. So I think that constantly you have to make sure that you're framing not just your criticism of current Israeli policy, but why you believe that there's a better future for both the United States and Israel in this relationship.
Well put. Let's talk about some of the Democratic candidates and where they may or may not differ on policy towards Israel. And unfortunately, a lot of this is quite literally punitive. I mean, so Mayor Pete, who will be here this weekend, has criticized the Israeli human rights record and said that as president, he wouldn't let U.S. taxpayer dollars be used to annex the West Bank, which suggests some sort of conditioning of aid. Elizabeth Warren has suggested that freezing aid is on the table as a possible pressure point to stop settlement construction. Bernie Sanders has talked about leveraging U.S. aid to end what he calls racist policies by Netanyahu, but he hasn't, I don't think, gotten that much more specific. Beto O'Rourke has called Bibi a racist and has generally talked about restricting the way U.S. aid can be used. I would say that Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Cory Booker have fairly traditional Democratic opinions. Question for both of you, how big or important do you think those distinctions are?
I mean, to me, I actually think Bernie, you can kind of single out Bernie in a certain way because Bernie's position, and I don't think any of the other candidates have articulated this, is that the threat that the world faces right now is that there's an axis of authoritarianism, and he puts Bibi in it, right? And so he kind of sees, kind of authoritarianism in the United States, in Turkey, in, all of these kind of backsliding countries, and he sees Israel in that context, whereas then you have these candidates kind of in the middle who still talk about Israel in the very traditional way as our most important, security partner in the Middle East, and, still kind of praise it in the most traditional ways, but are willing to tiptoe around some sort of aid conditionality, right? And with Pete, it's pretty specific. It's not even about settlements, right? It's just about U.S. funding for annexation. What I think is interesting is that this is going to be, I could be wrong, but I think that this is going to be the first presidential primary where some candidates will pay a price for being too pro-Israel, right? And that was never a thing before. And that could potentially change politics if there's a price to be paid for being too far right as well as to being too far left.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and first of all, I think it's time for this kind of conversation. I mean, the Israeli government, the current Prime Minister of Israel is actively opposed the Democratic Party himself in the last couple of elections.
You're not a fan?
Well, I mean, he's not a fan.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I think Michelle said something important, which is that part of what this is about is there's the old talking points, and we could all recite them from memory, right? About how do you talk about this. There's a frame within which politicians in the United States just talk about Israel. There's the first page in the debate preparation document, the first page that is in their heads in their interviews. And the fact is, it's out of date. I mean, because, just take two-state solution, you still have politicians in this country who are, programmed to talk about the two-state solution as if it's something that the Israeli Prime Minister is committed to. And they haven't even updated it for the fact that he has said it will not happen on his watch.
True.
And that he has said that he wants to annex the West Bank. And so you can't go around and say that, unconditional support for Israel, and I remain very committed to a two-state solution. Those two things don't match up. And so when I look at the when I look at the candidates, what I see is there are a set of candidates who are still operating within kind of the traditional frame. They're still talking about this in the same way. And then there are candidates who are trying to find what is the new way to talk about this issue. And certainly Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, and interestingly Buttigieg earlier in the primary, Beto, have been looking for that language of how can I articulate support for Israel while recognizing that we're in a new reality here. It's a new reality to have a government in Israel that is openly committed to the annexation of the West Bank. Yeah. I think there's another thing happening that's really important here, though, which is bigger than Israel, and it gets to your previous question, which is that the central question kind of in our time right now is this authoritarian trend that we see happening around the world. And I think it makes it incumbent upon the next president to try to be more consistent in terms of how do we support our values around the world. That I no longer feel comfortable giving this kind of open spigot of military assistance to a government like the government of Saudi Arabia that is chopping up journalists and propagating a famine in Yemen, right? And it gets to your point of like, are you singling out Israel? No, I would not want to give assistance that is about a certain kind of treatment of the Palestinians that I wouldn't want to see anybody treated that way anywhere in the world, right? And so it's a matter of having consistency. And now the incredibly complicated thing about the U.S.-Israel aid relationship is how do you then examine that, right? Because you're not, I don't think anybody is saying, like, let's just stop all assistance. We're saying, like, how do we make sure that we're not aiding and abetting the most extreme policies that are doing the most extreme damage to the prospect of there being any possibility for self-determination and dignity for Palestinians. But I think part of this has to be seen through a frame of we have to, as Americans, be more consistent in our foreign policy around our own principles. Because in this world, a world of this kind of mounting authoritarianism around the world, that is profoundly in our interests. Yeah. We have to get to that place where we can defend with pride what we are doing in terms of our relationships and our assistance relationships around the world.
Well said. Okay, when we come back, we'll be joined by Maysam Jaijuli and Mikhail Manikin. That's a fake, sort of a fake break. We're just going to bring another chair. How's everybody doing? I have no idea what's going to get applause in this room, just so you guys know. This has been it's been a real journey for me, but I'm learning a lot. Thank you, Jordan. And we're back. Okay, I would like to welcome Maysam Jaijuli and Mikhail Manikin to the stage. Maysam is a member of the National Leadership of Standing Together, and Mikhail is the director of the Alliance Fellowship. Please give it up for them. We all just hung out backstage for about 45 minutes, and nobody stopped talking the whole time. So I'm going to ask one question, which I assume will be it, to you guys, then we'll just go from there. So you just went through 2 elections. Sorry about that. You must be exhausted.
Really excited for a third, I bet.
Yeah. When it comes to effective activism, what approaches worked, what didn't, and how worried are you about a potential third election?
Okay, that's a 45-minute question.
There you go.
But well, I would say what worked probably most between the 2 elections is get out the vote campaigns for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So we have 20% of our 20% of thanks. I wasn't really connected to it, but yeah. So I would say 20% of our voter base are Palestinian citizens of Israel and are very relevant to what it means to be a progressive in Israel. And the vote went up from 50%. I know these numbers are very high compared to American standards, but they're low compared to Jewish Israeli standards. So Jewish Israelis vote at around 70%. And in the April election, Palestinian citizens of Israel voted at 50%. So there was a raise from 50% to 60%, and that really had a huge effect, both on how the elections turned out, but also on progressive language, what it means to be a progressive in Israel. I know.
Yes, I think, this is the most important thing. And if I take the election on April and the last election, I think that the key word was influence. Influence. Do I, as a voter, can influence politics in Israel, or I cannot influence political Israel? And I think that the Palestinian Israeli citizens really understood in these 3 months that they are influenced. I think that the declaration of Ayman Audi that we are willing to sit in a coalition was very crucial. And people understood that they may have influence. And you know what? I think the other parties, especially Kachol Lavan, Blue and White, learned a lesson from the April election. They learned a lesson, to, let's say, not attack the Palestinian Israeli citizen representative in the Knesset, not attack the Palestinian Israeli citizens community in Israel, and that worked.
One of the things that's interesting about watching this play out, when we were talking backstage, and I hate to invoke my mother, but I was saying that, my mother's like, an American Jew who follows these issues, and it was like, well, Israel used to be Golda Meir, and then it was Yitzhak Rabin, and now it's Bibi Netanyahu, and you don't see, and as the parties have fractured, right? It used to be, it was Labor and Likud, and I know what team I'm on in that equation, right? But now it's such a fractured landscape, and it's like every election there's some different coalition forming. We're here in a room of American progressive supporters of Israel and supporters of peace. What is it, do you think, Americans need to understand about what the Israeli left is today? And how that is different than it was 20 years ago. What is the Israeli left? If we can no longer identify it with one political party or one or two leaders who everybody knows their name, as activists, as people trying to build this movement, how would you describe who the left is, who the parties are, and where you see the future of progressive politics in Israel emanating from, in addition to what you just said about the Get Out the Vote effort?
You want me to start? Okay. Actually, I would have said that, when we think about the left in Israel, it's time to think about Jews and Palestinian Israeli citizens. Or you can use the term Arab Israelis. Till now, people, when they thought about the left, they never took into consideration the 20% of the population in Israel, the Palestinian Israeli citizens. And it's time to change it. We are a part of the left, and 70% of our citizens, of our population, represent themselves as leftists. And you know what? They're never been taken into consideration. They were taken into consideration, when we need them for supporting a coalition, not being in a coalition. And it was once in the Rabin government back in the 90s, and this should be changed. We are leftists. 70% of us say that they are leftist, and we should be a part of the left, not alliance to the left, a part of the left. Thank you. And when you said the left 20 years ago, I have no nostalgia for that left. Really. Yeah. I really don't have any nostalgia. I think that we have more leftist people now than we did back there. I think a lot of people from the Labour Party 20 years ago are much more right-wing than the Labour Party now. And I think that we are building a new platform for progressives left in Israel. And yes, it's not the things that we used to be. And this will be interesting, to see how it's going to develop.
And which issues we talk about the left, what are the animating issues to that participation and that change?
I think there are definitely talking from sort of like the Jewish Zionist left side, there are a lot of issues. Obviously security is a big issue, and the identity of the country, which is is maybe a bit more vague, but probably the central issue of sort of how do you imagine Israel is an issue that the left cares about. But Israel is a place where people live and have housing concerns and have economic concerns and have concerns on education and in health, and it's not just a battle of sort of like Jewish ideas. They're actually sort of very basic life issues which people are dealing with, church and state issues, which played out very big in the last election. And I want to echo in that sense what Maisam said from sort of a Zionist left side, that while it's true that the country is more fragmented than it was in the past, I think there's definitely in our generation, there's a search for coherency that wasn't in the past, meaning what does it mean to be a progressive, and that forces you to be a progressive on many issues, and that's an issue that sometimes doesn't get translated to an American audience. I mean, ultimately, if we're interested in democratic reform in Israel, even radical democratic reform in Israel, you're going to need to find people to do that. And that means those political alliances need to start being created in a more serious way, and not just sort of bypass that to a conversation about this is bad because of X and this is bad because of Y, which is important, but we also need to talk about who are the political actors who are going to fix things.
I just want to add to this that we need to mobilize people. We are really, the left, I think, ignored the people in the field. You know, they ignore the daily life of the people, and that what we need to do our best in order to convince people that our way and our vision is the right vision. And when I say left, I say left, peace, ending the occupation, equality, and social justice. This is what is the left should be about. And I think that nowadays we have also platforms, political platforms, not party platforms, who are trying to mobilize people toward this vision. I'm a part of Standing Together, Omdim Biyachad, which is really doing this job in the field in Israel. And I think that our job is to increase the participation of people, to mobilize people, to struggle, because without struggle, the struggle will give us hope to change the reality in Israel. We should not wait for politicians. We should do it.
So I want to ask you guys, because, I mean, the right in America and the right in Israel are very good at working together. What could, either the left in America or the Democratic Party in America do to buttress what you're trying to do?
Well, first of all, I think it's understanding that it's also has to be a conversation about politics and power, meaning the relationship ultimately is a political relationship. I think liberals and progressives on both sides like to imagine a time which never really existed of a bipartisan relationship between both sides, and there's like, we need to go back to this bipartisanship, and I actually don't want to go back to this bipartisanship. I want to work with progressives. And I think understanding, I feel I have, a great sense of admiration and relationship with progressives, Jewish progressives and non-Jewish progressives in the U.S. I'm interested in learning. Sometimes we're interested in teaching. We're interested in having a conversation, but making sure that that's a conversation on politics. So in a way, we actually need to politicize ourselves more on this relationship and get out of this conversation which sees politics as something which is problematic or fearful or something that we want to stay away from.
So, to that end, a bunch of Democrats who want to be president are coming to this conference. What do you want to hear from them when it comes to U.S. policy towards Israel or support for the PA or Middle East peace, like whatever you want?
What should we ask them?
What should we ask them? We need some help. We have to figure out the questions.
Me as a Palestinian Israeli citizen, I have so many questions to ask them because I really never understood the American politics toward Israel. For me, it seems to be, that it was a one-way, relationship, a one-way relationship which supports Israel, and anything that Israel does, it have the support for Democrats and also Republicans. But for me, I all the time say, why they don't come to us? Why they don't come to ask us what is to live in Israel, as a minority, as a big minority, 20% of the population. Does it, the relationship between, we are a part of the Israeli society, and, we've never been there. So I would want to see more engagement to the real life in Israel, not only the high politics. I don't want the candidates to come, with a list that their advisors wrote for them. I want them to learn more and to be engaged to a wider range of Israelis. And this is, and then I will ask a question. First of all, let them learn more about it.
I want to add, it's maybe a bit more sort of wonky, but I think I think the issue of two states is not enough, meaning saying we want two states means so many different things to so many different candidates and so many different people. I mean, it's been said by anywhere from Netanyahu and to the left of that the question of frameworks and the question of what does that actually entail, and are we talking about a full end to the occupation or a more moderate sort of control over the Palestinian people, I think it's really important for Democrats to speak about in a more serious way, especially now when the conversation in Israel, maybe sadly by the center, is like presenting this version of, well, we're ending the occupation, but we're not really. I think Democrats need to give a stronger line on the two-state issue, and definitely in terms of the political frameworks of that. And I would also add that, and this relates to the last point, that Israeli progressives and liberals need to be held accountable to Democrats, and Democrats need to be held accountable to Israeli progressives. And it's not enough for me that they criticize Netanyahu. I actually want them to say what they'll be working on as an opposition or as an alternative to Netanyahu. I think that, that's important.
Well, one of the, you mentioned the two-state, the language around the two-state solution, which I was saying before you guys came out, is kind of routinized in a way that it means nothing. Yeah. It's just something that people say to sound like, they're reasonable. And what I was struck by too is I feel like in the Obama administration, we should have been clearer about our own positions in terms of final status issues, for instance, much earlier. John Kerry gave a speech towards the very end of the administration, in which he laid out our positions on not just security and territory, but Jerusalem and refugees as well. And part of this is because when Obama, because you get attacked, Obama, when he gave a speech in which he just put out positions in 2011 on just borders and security, which were the widely known U.S. negotiating positions dating all the way back to Bill Clinton, it was, first of all, Bibi Netanyahu came to the Oval Office and lectured him, completely mischaracterized what he'd said, said it was just 67 lines, ignored the fact that there could be any swaps.
Do you remember the little, so Obama does that meeting with Netanyahu, the Israeli team leaves, we come in to prep before the press came in. Do you remember the little, chat we had with him? He's like, how'd you think that went? You could tell he was, pretty pissed, but trying to decide if he was going to be publicly pissed.
Yeah, he was pissed.
He was publicly pissed.
He got more and more pissed as he thought about it. But, part of this is that there was always something, and this gets to your point about the weaponization of this anti-Semitism issue. It's like everything else in our politics. There's always going to be something that they say you're trying to, I remember one time there wasn't a photographer in the meeting, and it became a 6-year thing, that there was this one meeting where there wasn't an official photographer. I'm going down a tangent here. Yeah. What I'm trying to get to is Palestinian recognition. Yeah. And just the idea of taking positions on these issues obviously has been this third rail we've crossed it. But how we've been talking, a lot of the debate here has been about conditioning of assistance. What about the possibility of American recognition of a Palestinian state? And how would that?
I think, being in the opposition, as we both know at this point, is not that great. But one thing it does allow you to do is to be more coherent about your positions. And it seems like even though we're in the opposition, we're still sort of in a negotiation mode. Even though nobody's negotiating with us, we're still well, maybe we'll take this out, we'll leave this in. We can allow ourselves to be much more coherent about endgame. And when I say endgame, it's even on the ideological side. So I remember I don't think they use this phrase anymore in the US, but we used to talk about a secure Israel and a viable Palestine. And that always sounded weird to me because if you flip it, it gets everybody nervous, like a viable Israel and a secure Palestine and it says something about the lack of parity and the lack of fairness coming from a position of negotiation. Mm-hmm. And now that we're, at this point at least, sort of looking at things from the other side, I think it's a really good time to clear our head and to be more honest about where we want to get to in the end. When we'll be in power, we can start negotiating, but let's talk about where we actually want to end. And from our perspective, it's a maximalist two-state version in which both societies are equally free and independent.
Yeah. Yes, I think that the two-state solution is really what we should aim to. But we need really to take it, seriously, not only by declaration. And what happens till now, it's only declaration. Even though, in the Obama demonstration, it was a big declaration. But me, as a Palestinian, I didn't feel that action were done toward really having the two-state solution. I think that a politician in the United States and also the presidents of the United States, they don't have this courage to say it's not only about Israeli security, it's about the Palestinian people who wants their freedom, they want their own country, and it's time. God, it's time. Afterward, when establishing independent state, a Palestinian independent state, we can also talk about other solutions that they will make come. People now talking about the one-state solution or confederation. But what we need to do is to declare and to work forward the two-state solution soon.
When people talk, because people talk about the one-state solution here, the BDS movement is, if not kind of mainstream, it's popular on college campuses. Is that helpful to you to have pressure coming from the left, or do you feel like that undermines you?
I kind of think it's always good to have pressure from the left. I mean, I have my position, and my position is based on, and I said in the beginning that I'm coming also from a certain place. I believe in many things. Part of that is Jewish right to self-determination. So obviously that puts me in a certain camp. But I think sort of trying to police the conversation happening from the left definitely is counterproductive. I think it sometimes points you in directions which you're unaware of, and you see that on issues of you see that on issues of Israel. You see that on other issues as well. I don't think we need to be constantly sort of looking over our shoulder and getting worried about. I have my own positions, but I'm not. But it's fine that other people have other positions. We don't need to freak out about everything that's not what we think.
You know what? Every pressure from the left, from everyone, will be good. The question is that meanwhile we are talking 70 years, more than 70 years, we are only talking about these issues and nothing have been done yet. And this is our problem, I think that a lot of the Palestinians who live now in the West Bank and Gaza are desperate. I talk to a lot of my people, and they say that they're desperate, that they have no hope, and we should return the hope to these people. And returning the hope to these people means that negotiating now. Yeah.
So I think this has to be our last question because we're running out of time. But the conversation about the U.S.-Israeli relationship can often feel a little too negative, right? We talk about how Trump has gone all in on Bibi and Bibi's corrupt and people feel like the two-state solution might be dead. But you guys were telling us backstage, so there's actually a lot more to be hopeful about and excited about when it comes to progressive parties in Israel. Can you relay that conversation backstage to this group? So
it was more convincing backstage
that we heard.
To be fair, I think that a position, like the disposition and temperament of activists tend to be optimistic. And, we're all in this business because we have this sort of odd notion that if we're more professional, if we're more serious about our work, we can actually change reality around us, which is obviously sort of a stretch. That being said, I think progressivism around the world, but definitely in Israel from our vantage point, has a lot of new trends and tendencies that I at least don't know from the past. We've been working a lot together in the Alliance Fellowship over the last 2 years. In the past, the Israeli Jewish left and the Israeli Arab left, Palestinian left, just worked in complete parallels. It's not that we were against each other. It's not that we were for each other. We just didn't work with. Now we're talking about double the size. This isn't a small half mandate conversation. 40% of the people who self-identify as left in Israel are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and just that understanding is so optimistic and hopeful in what you can double in size if you work if you work more seriously and also more honestly, but this isn't only a question of tactics and strategy, it's also a question of how do we perceive our identity. And maybe just to close that, I mean, I think like we're the first generation, definitely from a Jewish perspective, that was I was born in a safe and secure and powerful Israel. And so Israel existed before I was born, but people still had this fear of non-existence. Now I was born into a regional superpower. And that allows for more listening and more responsibility and sort of restructuring that element, and actually to a huge amount of potential just in terms of sort of who do we talk to, how do we engage, how do we perceive ourselves, what risks are we willing to take?
I just want to give example why I am optimistic. I'm not taking you far away. I'm taking you only for last year, 1918. You know, we were in the streets. We are progressives. We were 10,000s of us in the streets in so many struggles. Let's count together. We were in the struggle against the nation-state law. We were in the struggle for the LGBTQ community. We were in the struggle for the disabled people in Israel. And we were in a huge struggle against, deporting the asylum seekers in Israel, and we succeeded. And we also held the biggest women demonstration and strike that ever take place in Israel. For the first time, women, Jewish and Arab women, shoulder to shoulder, went to the streets and, demonstrated against the domestic violence against women in Israel. It was fascinating to see tens of thousands of women in Kikar Rabin, in the Rabin Square, shouting together in Hebrew and in Arabic, "Dai dai leratzach nashim, kafa liqatl nisa," stop killing women. And we succeeded. We succeeded in these struggles. And this is, the example that lead us to conclude that we can do it. We have the power, and we can do it.
All right. I think that was.
I think one thing is important is you can kind of learn. It's interesting to look at the strategies of people like Trump and Netanyahu, which is that really they depend on two things. More than that, but two that I'll focus on. One is apathy, that you will believe that this can't change. So it's not even worth trying. And we're going to make this look so ugly and so cynical or so inevitable that you just have to give up. And the other thing is, it's not a surprise when you look at the disinformation efforts that come in to right-wing politics, far-right politics. It's meant to divide progressives. Yep. That's what it usually is about, try to sow discord. And what we have to remember is the corollary to that is, one, we have agency. We have a lot of agency. The people in this room have a lot of agency. I met you when I was 29 years old and moved out to work for Barack Obama, and I was the oldest guy working for him. I don't even know how old you were, Tommy. But there was just a bunch of 20-something-year-old kids in Barack Obama, and look what happened there. I never forgot that lesson of agency. But the agency only works if people build coalitions and are united by their common values. And we just have to remind ourselves as progressives in the United States and Israel and around the world at this really existential moment for all of us, that if we claim our own agency and we build those coalitions, we will win.
That's right. Before we wrap, one sort of point of personal privilege, speaking of agency.
I was teeing you up.
We're in D.C. Very, very effectively. We're in D.C. right now. There's some really important elections in Virginia that are happening real soon. We win 2 seats in the House, 2 seats in the Senate. We take back the legislature right before redistricting, so it's a big deal. So if you want to get involved, go to votesaveamerica.com. We have all kinds of information there. Thank you, Maisam. Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, J Street, for having us. Great to see you all. More music. Bye, guys.